In a world where loyalty and duplicity intersect, much like the intricate machinations of Michael Cofield in Prison Break, we find ourselves lured into the lives of individuals who dare to disobey the laws just as Mitchell skillfully plotted his escape while navigating love and betrayal. So too does Susana Simpson find herself ensnared in a hazardous web of passion and prison etiquette. When a new inmate, Rodger Victor, enters Riverbend Penitentiary, his flamboyant presence shakes the fundamental foundations of Susana's neatly controlled universe. Their chats mimic the complexity of Michael and Ara's relationship, generating feelings that threaten to upend all she holds dear. Can Susana keep control as she becomes entangled in a romance that defies expectation, or will she, like Ara, realize that love within a jail can lead to unthinkable consequences? As we dive into Susana's journey, we observe the delicate balance between order and chaos, where every choice becomes a high-stakes gamble, a captivating narrative that may very well mimic the tremendous drama of a catastrophic conclusion. If you are a fan of the movie Prison Break, you should watch till the end to see how this all ends, and you may also hit the subscribe button, like and give your thoughts a sharp opening. Allowed an armored van for corrections. Susana Simpson was absently stirring her long, cold coffee as she watched it approach from the window of her office on the third level of the administration building. Like herself, she was the model of discipline and order at her office on the enormous wood desk. Each document was neatly organized. During her 2 years in the prison system, Riverbend Penitentiary welcomed the October morning with its regular routine. The massive gates opened at 7:03, the computer display was properly aligned, and even the blinds on the windows hung with mathematical precision. Today's shipment only carried one prisoner, demonstrating Susana Simpson's ability to value order above everything else. The case of Rodger Victor, a 34-year-old college graduate convicted of grand fraud years ago, had been on the warden's desk for a week after he was moved from the Nevada State Penitentiary Company, a duct that was employed at the jail library. Susana strolled down to the reception area after fixing her well-groomed, graying hair. Her heels pounded steadily. Victor, who looked to be a tall, well-built guy with regular features and an alert expression in his brown eyes, was feared and revered as she went past the guards standing at attention on the concrete floor. Despite having his hands in handcuffs, he carried himself with a certain calm dignity. "Welcome to Riverbend, Mr. Victor," Susana said in a cool, silky voice. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice seeming pleasant with a hint of humor. "You will be working in our library, which is a privilege easily lost. Any infraction and you'll go to the general block. I'm the warden, Mrs. Simpson. We have strict rules, and we expect them to be strictly enforced." The library was the pride of Riverbend, with books, a computer catalog, and a large reading room. Classes for prisoners who wanted to receive an education were held there, and Victor nodded slightly, a little smile spreading across his lips as though he was delighted by his superior's harshness. Susana personally completed the papers and gave the warden the new prisoner. Back in her office was Dakota Ramsey, a young lady with a military demeanor and a keen eye. Susana took another look at Victor's paperwork, but something about it worried her, possibly the little smirk or the two direct stares. The first thing you discovered was that prison was not a place for arrogance. The day proceeded as usual behind bars, with staff meetings and inspections of the grounds. Susana saw Victor again in the library in the evening. He was methodically organizing the books and taking notes in a journal. His movements were precise and sure, as if he'd been doing it all his life. "How are you settling in?" she asked, stopping at a shelving unit. "The cataloging system is a little different from what I'm used to, but I'll figure it out," he replied without pausing from his work. Riverbend had its own rules, and there was a hierarchy among the inmates and the staff. Susana hummed, "I hope you live up to the recommendation," adding that typically inmates don't notice such details on the first day. He then remarked, "Dry and left." "I will absolutely do that, Mrs. Simpson," he replied after her. His voice had that slight smirk in it. Once more Susana had already caught herself reading his file again in her office. There was clearly something wrong with this Rodger Victor that she was still unable to identify. Susana Simpson didn't like mysteries. Outside the window, darkness was thickening. Riverbend was preparing for lights out. Somewhere in the back of the pre-on building, a siren sounded, calling the inmates to their cells. Another day was drawing to an end. Another inmate had entered the well-oiled system. Susana didn't know that this day would be the beginning of a narrative that would change her life forever. A month passed. Rodger Victor rapidly put the library in order. The catalog was updated with pedantic precision. Books were returned to the shelves on checkout day, and the reading room was always immaculately clean. Even the most fastidious wardens couldn't find Anything to complain about? Susana looked into the library more and more often on the pretext of hacking, and he noticed how skillfully Victor dealt with the other prisoners. He never raised his voice, but his requests were obeyed without question. That evening, she stayed in the library longer than usual. Victor was arranging books in the far corner when she stopped at the shelf of classic literature. "You've reorganized the classics section," she remarked, running her finger along the spines. "Yes, by chronology of works," he echoed, coming closer. "It's simpler to trace the development of literary movements that way." "Amazing approach." Susana took up a worn volume from the shelf. "Jane Austen. I haven't reread it in a while." "Pride and Prejudice." He sounded genuinely interested. "Or Emma." She paused. "Are you well acquainted with her work?" "I studied English literature at university." He shrugged. "Austen was the subject of my thesis. Her understanding of human nature is remarkable." "Why accurate." They talked for nearly an hour. Victor proved to be a great conversationalist, an erudite with a sharp mind and an unexpected sense of humor. He talked about literature with a passion that surprised Susana. From that evening on, their conversations became regular. They discussed Dickens, argued about modern prose, and shared their impressions of poetry. Susana caught herself looking forward to these conversations. "And yes, you don't look like a financial swindler," she once said. "What should a financial fraudster look like?" He smiled. "A man in a nice suit." "Why?" A shark smile. Maybe he looked at him attentively, but surely not a lover of Victorian leader. "Auteur life is full of contradictions, Mrs. Simpson." He held her gaze. "Sometimes we don't know what we're capable of ourselves." Something flared in his brown eyes that made her uncomfortable, but the feeling immediately faded. Dakota Ramsey was the first to notice the change in her boss's demeanor. Mrs. Simpson smiled more often and appeared in the library almost every evening. One day, Dakota heard them laughing, muffled and almost intimate. "He's a manipulator," Dr. Frost, the prison doctor, had once said when she and Dakota ran into each other in the dining room. "I've seen a few of those. He knows how to make himself comfortable." Dakota kept silent. She was committed to her boss and wasn't about to discuss her with anyone. Susana found herself thinking more and more about the library, the calm evenings among the books, the unhurried conversations, and the look in his brown eyes, the challenge in them. He realized that these conversations were beyond the normal interactions between warden and prisoner, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel like following the rules. "Have you read this?" he asked once, holding out a book to her. Their fingers touched for a moment. Susana jerked her hand away as if their breathing could be heard in the silence of the library. "It's getting late," she said abruptly. "Time to close the library." He nodded silently, but his look told her that this was only the beginning of something she couldn't or wouldn't name yet. That night, Susana couldn't sleep for a long time. He thought about how easily her impeccable reputation could be ruined, how fragile the line between order and chaos was, and how some books were better left closed. But it was too late. The story had begun to write its own plot, and Susana Simpson had unwillingly become its protagonist. December was unusually cold. The prison walls seemed frozen solid, and even the old heating system could not cope with the biting wind. Susana stayed late in her office more and more often, going over documents by the light of the desk lamp. At least that's how she rationalized her presence in the prison. After lights out that evening, she took a particularly long look at herself in the mirror in the office bathroom. 3 years old, the creases around her eyes had become more visible, and the gray in her hair was no longer covered by coloring. Susana had long ago concluded it was a sign of weakness. The austere suit sat wonderfully on her still slender body. He spotted her reflection straightening her hair and felt annoyed with herself. The walk to the library took exactly hour minutes. Susana knew every turn, every security camera, knew there was a security shift in the west hallway between, and knew that Dakota Ramsey was on duty in the other wing. That knowledge should have been alarming, but somehow it only stirred her blood. Victor was waiting for her. He always somehow knew when she was coming. Eating at the far table lit by the only lamp, he read when he heard her footsteps. He looked up and smiled, that special smile that took Susana's breath away. "I was thinking about our chat yesterday," he began as she sat down across from him, "about free will and the predetermination of fate." "And what conclusion did you come to?" Her voice sounded hoarse. "That sometimes our decisions are already determined for us. All that remains is to accept them." His fingers moved across the table, almost touching her hand. Susana didn't pull away. "Those are dangerous thoughts, Mr. Victor." "Rodger," he corrected softly. "When we're alone, I'd like to hear my name." He shook her head, but he had already taken her hand and his palm was warm and surprisingly smooth for a prisoner. "This is crazy," she muttered. "Perhaps," he agreed, "but isn't that the beauty of it?" The first kiss happened right then, in the semi-darkness of the library among the dusty volumes of classic literature. It had been 10 Almost pursued Victor kissed her as if she were a fragile jewel later. There were other evenings, other kisses, not so innocent anymore, caresses that made her dizzy, whispers in the dark. The constant fear of being discovered only heightened the senses by day. Susana was the same name as before, a tough, demanding boss. He held meetings, reprimanded negligent employees, inspected cameras, but now there was a mystery in her life that colored the gray everyday existence. With bright colors. Victor was changing too. In the company of the other convicts, he was aloof, but once they were alone, the mask slipped. He told her about his youth in a little town in Idaho, about his hopes of becoming a writer, about how his quest for easy money had brought him to jail. "I have no regrets," he said one day as they sat in the quiet of the library. "If it hadn't been for all this, I never would have met you." Susana realized that every time they met was a step into the abyss. He tried to resist the attraction several times. She decided to stop seeing each other, but every evening her feet carried her to the library. Dr. Frost made more frequent appearances in the administration wing. Her attentive gaze followed Susana during general meetings. Once, she tried to start a conversation about the strange behavior of some of the inmates, but Susana cut her off halfway through. Dakota Ramsey understood too. One day, she ran into the warden outside the library after lights out. Their gazes met, and Susana saw in the young warden's eyes a silent promise of secrecy. Meanwhile, her relationship with Victor was growing deeper. They no longer met only in the library, Susana's office, empty classrooms, even the old back room. All these places kept their secret. "We should be more careful," Susana would remark after a particularly hazardous encounter. "Are you worried?" he would ask, kissing her neck. "No," she would answer, and it was true. She wasn't afraid of exposure or embarrassment. He was afraid of what was happening to her heart. Every night, sleeping in her empty bed, Susana analyzed the situation. He tried to find the moment when everything changed, when the prisoner, Rodger Victor, became just Rodger, a man whose mere sight made her shake. Then the thing she feared most happened one morning. Looking in the mirror, she said it out loud, "I'm in love with him." That confession should have frightened her, sobered her, but instead of fear came a strange relief. It was as if she had finally stopped fighting the current and let the river carry her. That evening, she came to the library earlier than usual. It was as if Victor sensed the change in her. He didn't say anything, just put his arms around her and pulled her close. There was more in that embrace than in all the words in the world. Now was falling outside the library window. Where in the depths of the sun, the heating pipes were humming. Susana Simpson, the warden of Riverbend Women's Prison, stood in the arms of a prisoner and felt truly alive. For the first time in years he did not yet know that this winter would be the last of her former life, that soon everything would change irrevocably, that the price for these moments of happiness would be unimaginably high. But for now, she just stood there with her eyes closed, listening to the heartbeat of the man she had no right to love. January brought snowstorms and temper, a tourist well over -2. The old prison building was drafty, the prisoners were wrapped in blankets, and the staff tried to stay close to the heaters. But it was as if Susana didn't notice a fire burning inside her that no amount of frost could extinguish. Their meetings with Victor became almost daily. He had learned to find excuses for late checks, and he always knew how to divert the attention of the other inmates. The library had secluded nooks, known only to them, behind the racks of legal books where the light of the surveillance cameras didn't reach. In a small back room filled with old catalog boxes, he asked, "Did you ever think you could do something like this?" As they lay on a library plaid spread out and the floor. "To do what exactly?" She ran her finger across his chest, outlining the tattoo, a strange pattern that looked like a Celtic ornament. "On such recklessness or passion, at the risk of losing everything." Susana stayed silent. She had long ago stopped analyzing her behavior. For the first time in her life, she let herself just feel. Dakota Ramsey had first seen them together in mid-January. He was checking the core before lights out and heard a strange noise coming from the library. When she opened the door, she saw her supervisor pressed against a bookcase. Victor was kissing her neck, and she rolled her head back, closing her eyes. Dakota silently backed away, covering the door. Her cheeks burned, but not from embarrassment, from the realization of responsibility. He remembered how Susana had ended her career 5 years ago when the young warden had been accused of abuse of power. Now it was time to repay the kindness. From that day on, Dakota became their unspoken guardian. He happened to be in the right quarters, diverted the attention of the other warders, and created safe time slots. Susana never spoke to her directly about it, but sometimes their gazes met, and the warden nodded slightly, a sign of appreciation and trust. Victor had changed too. There was a special softness in his movements. When he looked at Susana he could spend hours telling her stories about his life, about traveling, about people he'd met, about books that had influenced him. "You know what the most amazing thing is," he said one night. "I feel more free here with you than I ever did on the outside." Susana understood him. He too never felt so alive, so real. It was as if she had worn a mask all her previous life and now she was finally able to take it off. Their passion was becoming more and more uncontrollable. They took more and more risks, stayed longer and longer. One day, they almost got caught when Dr. Frost unexpectedly returned to the medical office for her forgot. "Enke's Victor barely had time to hide in a closet." "This madness has to stop," Susana said then. Once the danger had passed. "Is this really what you want?" he asked, pulling her to him. He didn't answer. They both knew the answer. In early February, the thing Susana feared most happened. He began to plan for the future, imagining what would happen when Victor was released. There were still years left on his sentence, but she was already dreaming of the lake house, the quiet evenings together, the possibility of just being a couple. "You've got wrinkles around your eyes when you smile," he remarked once, running his finger over her face. "I'm getting old." She grinned. "You're beautiful." He kissed every wrinkle, just the way you were on those rare nights when she was alone. Susana attempted to picture how it would all end. Times she thought she glimpsed shadows of the future, dark, terrifying shadows. But in the morning, all fears disappeared. All that remained was the need to see him, to touch him, to hear his voice. Then something happened that altered everything. One evening, Victor was particularly pensive. He was silent for a long time, combing through her graying hair, and then he said quietly, "There's something you ought to know about me." But he didn't have time to finish. Footsteps were heard in the hallway, and they had to leave in a hurry. The next day, Susana received the results of a routine medical examination. Dakota Ramsey later recalled that nothing changed in the atmosphere of the prison that day. It was as if the temperature had dropped a few more degrees, as if the shadows in the corners had grown thicker, as if fate itself was holding its breath, preparing to strike. But no one knew that a storm was coming that would sweep away everything in IT's path, and that the price of passion would be unimaginably high. The envelope with the test results lay on Susana's desk like a ticking time bomb. Dr. Frost had brought it personally, and she could tell by the look on her face that something was wrong. "Have a seat, Mrs. Simpson." The doctor's voice sounded unaccustomed. He ran her eyes over the lines of the medical report. Numbers, terms, and acronyms blended into a blurry stream. Only two words stood out, as if written in blood: HIV positive. "It's a mistake." Her own voice sounded foreign to her. "We've double-checked 3 times." Dr. Frost paused. "Mrs. Susana Simpson, you need to recall all contacts from the last. Leave me alone." The order sounded like a whip crack. Left alone, Susana sat motionless, staring into the space in front of her. Scraps of phrases swirled in her head. "There's something you should know about me. I have no regrets. If it weren't for all this, age came in waves." He remembered every touch, every kiss, every night he'd known. All this time he'd known. He entered the library at 9 p.m. sharp. Victor was reading, sitting at his usual desk. He lifted his head, smiled, and the smile froze on his lips when he saw her face. "You knew." Not a question, a statement. He closed the book slowly, his hands, usually so confident, trembled slightly. "Yes." "How long ago?" 3 years. "Learned it in a Nevada prison." Susana looked at him, and she thought she was seeing him for the first time. A handsome face, attentive brown eyes, a slight gray on his temples, the man she trusted with everything. "Why, I fell in love with you." He stood up, trying to move closer. "I was afraid of losing you." "Don't you dare." Her voice was quiet, but there was steel ringing in it. "Don't you dare speak of love. Susana, you used me. All this talk of books, all these stories, you were just looking for a way to get to me." "No, it was all real. Every word, every touch was poison," she said in a near whisper. "You poisoned me, Victor." In every way he tried to say something, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "You know what the worst part is? I actually loved you. For the first time in my life, I let myself." Her voice trailed off. Susana turned around and walked toward the exit. At the right door, she stopped without turning around. "Tomorrow you'll be transferred to the high security unit. Hope you'll be comfortable there." "Susana, please." He closed the door, cutting off his words. The hallway was dark and cold. Somewhere, water dripped measuredly, like a metronome. 2, 3 in her office, Susana pulled Rodger Victor's personnel file from the safe. Now she saw what she had missed before: the hints in the characterizations, the odd gaps in the medical records, the transfer from Nevada for health reasons. Her hands didn't shake when she signed the transfer order. Her handwriting was as smooth as ever, only the letters seemed sharper, as if each was a small knife. Dakota Ramsey, when she received the order the next morning, didn't ask a single question. Something in her superior's face stopped all possible words that night. Susana did not sleep. He sat in her office, looking out the window at the snow-covered prison yard. Somewhere out there, in a cell, sat the man she loved, the man who had killed her. Slowly, calculatingly, with a smile on his lips, in the desk drawer lay a gun, a service weapon she almost never used. Susana pulled it out, weighed it in her hand. Revenge was a dish served cold. She knew that better than most, and she had a plan. The high-security unit smelled of fear and chlorine. Rodger knew what awaited him. After years in various prisons, he'd learned to read the signs. The two guards who led him down the humming corridor did not hide. Their smirks, their crude jokes echoed off the walls. The new cell was half the size of the old one, a narrow bun, covered with gray laundered linens, a toilet without a lid, a sink with peeling enamel, and thick metal bars that divided the world into before and after. "Welcome to hell, pretty boy," one of the escorts grinned as he slammed the door shut. This block held the most dangerous crimemen, ALS, murderers, rapists, prison gang leaders. Rodger could hear their voices, hoarse shouts, laughter, threats. The cell across the hall belonged to Roy Butcher Harris, convicted of a triple murder. To the right sat Marcus Wayne, who had beaten two guards to death in an Atlanta jail. "Hey, librarian," someone shouted. "How do you like our suite?" Rodger was silent. He thought of Susana, the way she had stood in the library, straight and motionless like a statue, about the way her voice had trembled when she'd spoken of love. He thought about the fact that he really loved her, perhaps for the first time in his life. He truly loved a woman. The walk in the yard was at 2 in the afternoon. The maximum security prisoners went into a separate pen fenced in with a double row of barbed wire. Rodger felt the stares, heavy, assessing, hostile. "Heard you, the boss." Roy Harris appeared like a shadow, massive with a scarred face. "Nice job, huh?" "None of your business," Rodger replied calmly. The blow came in the solar plexus, quick, professional. Rodger bent in half, gulping frosty air with his mouth. "Mine now." Harris leaned in close to his ear. "Everything that happens here is my business." The guard's P.R.E. tended not to notice anything. Rodger realized this was just the beginning. News of his affair with the warden had already spread throughout Riverbend Penitentiary. For men like Harris, it was a gift of fate, an opportunity to put the upstart in his place. That evening, lying on the hard bunk, Rodger listened to the sounds of the cell block. Somewhere, a prisoner was screaming. Like a nightmare, the guard's keys jingled, water dripped from a faulty faucet. He thought of the library, the smell of old books, the silence of the reading room, the warm evenings with Susana. It all seemed like another life now, almost a dream. "Hey, kid," Marcus Wayne's voice came through the wall. "You know what they're going to do to you, don't you?" Rodger knew there was no room in the prison hierarchy for those who slept with their superiors, especially if it ended in scandal. The next day during lunch, someone accidentally pushed his tray. Hot soup spilled out onto his robe. His soap disappeared in the shower room. Minor bullying, harbingers of greater misfortune. Dakota Ramsey occasionally walked past his cell. Her face was impenetrable, but once she lingered a second longer than usual. "He really loved you." It sounded like a judgment. By the end of the week, Rodger noticed that the guards were passing his cell less frequently at certain hours. The corridor seemed to die out. He knew it meant he was in for a surprise. Friday night, he wrote a letter to Susana. He wrote 3 pages in small handwriting, trying to explain the inexplicable. He told her about his diagnosis, about his fear of loneliness, about how it was impossible to resist her strength and vulnerability, about how every word of love was true. He gave the letter to the young guard, slipping him a stashed pack of cigarettes. He promised to pass it on, but Rodger knew Susana would never read it. At lunch on Monday, he caught Harris's eye. He nodded faintly to someone behind Rodger's back and smiled slowly, anticipative. Rodger realized the time had come. He could have asked for protection, could have tried to negotiate, but something inside him felt petrified. Perhaps it was redemption. Maybe it was just fatigue that night. He stared into the darkness of the cell for a long time. Where, at the other end of the prison, in his office sat the woman he loved, who had betrayed him, who now wanted him dead. "Forgive me," he whispered into the darkness, but the darkness did not answer. The morning of February was unusually clear. Susana Simpson arrived at the prison earlier than usual. He checked the mail, signed documents, and held a brief meeting with the staff. No one noticed that her right hand occasionally touched the desk drawer where the gun lay. Dakota Ramsey came on shift at 7 in the morning. As she passed Rodger's cell, she noticed that he was awake, sitting on his bunk, staring. At one point he had a strange expression on his face, a mixture of doom and determination. Dr. Frost made her rounds as she entered the high-security cell block. She heard Roy Harris talking softly to his cellmates. Scraps of phrases made her shiver. She wanted to warn her superior, but then changed her mind. After all, it was none of her business. By lunchtime, the prison was unusually quiet. The prisoners were talking in whispers. The guards were tense. It was as if everyone sensed trouble was coming. At 2, Rodger asked to go to the infirmary, saying he had a bad headache on the way. He turned down a side corridor. The guard who accompanied him accidentally lagged behind for a few minutes. The library was empty. Rodger walked slowly between the shelves, touching the spines of the books. Everything was still the same here. The smell of paper, the silence, the muted light from the tall windows. Only now, it seemed like the setting for a play that was coming to an end. At 3, Susana received a note. He is in the library. The handwriting was unfamiliar. He folded the paper 4 times and burned it with a lighter. Dakota Ramsey watched a group of prisoners, led by Harris, move down the hallway. They walked at a leisurely, confident pace, as if they knew exactly where they were going and why. He turned away and began to check her pop. RS. At 3:3, there was a scream in the library, a short, terrible one, as if a man was trying to say something and couldn't. Then there was silence. Susana sat in her office, slowly going through the papers. Her hands were calm, her breathing even. Only the whitened knuckles gave away her inattention. At 4, a young guard found the body. Rodger lay between the shelves among the scattered books. His face was unrecognizably disfigured. Multiple stab wounds darkened his chest. Dr. Frost, examining the body, noted a strange detail. A book was clutched in the dead man's hand, Jane Austen's Reasoning, a tattered hardcover. Dakota Ramsey watched Harris and his men return to their cell block. Their hands were clean, their robes neatly buttoned, only their eyes glittered with feverish excitement. At the detectives arrived at the prison. Susana met them in her office, collected, professional. With a perfectly even voice, she answered questions clearly and matter-of-factly. No one noticed how she covered her eyes for a moment when the detectives mentioned the crime scene. No one saw her lips quiver as they described the condition of the body. Only Dakota Ramsey, standing in the corner of the office, noticed that the supervisor never once said the name of the murdered man. It was as if Rodger Victor had already become a ghost, one of many that haunted the gloomy corridors of Riverbend Penitentiary. Why? By nightfall, the prison had regained its usual order. Only the library was dark, where the police were working. Fluorescent lights illuminated the crime scene, turning blood into black stains on the worn linoleum. In her office, Susana Simpson stared out the window at the snow-covered yard. A loaded pistol lay in her desk drawer. He never used it. She didn't have to. Revenge did turn out to be a dish served cold. Detectives Ashton Graves and H. Malloy arrived in Riverbend Penitentiary the morning after the murder. Graves, a large man with a streak in his dark hair, had specialized in prison crimes for years. Malloy was his complete opposite, petite, red-haired, with sharp-looking green eyes. They surveyed the crime scene in silence. The library still bore marks of last night's tragedy, dried blood stains on the floor, overturned shelves, scattered books. Weird, Malloy muttered, squatting down beside a blood-stained look. Ashton, the spatter on the shelving units is angled. He was hit from top to bottom. Graves nodded. He was already lying down when the main blows were delivered. Doesn't look like a spontaneous prison fig. Height. This was an execution. The first person they questioned was Dr. Frost. The young woman was nervously rubbing the chain of her glasses as she recounted the autopsy results. 23 stab wounds, multiple head injuries. But there's something interesting. Handcuff marks on his wrists. He was restrained. How many people were involved in the murder? Based on the nature of the injuries, at least 4. Dakota Ramsey proved to be a difficult witness. He answered briefly, looking somewhere over Malloy's head. Where were you at the time of the murder? Checking paperwork in the administration building. Did you see anyone suspicious? Everyone in prison is suspicious. Detective Graves noticed how she faltered for a moment when it came to Susana Simpson. They left the warden for last. He received them in her office, impeccably dressed, calm, with a perfectly straight back. Mr. Ketty used to work in the library. Yes, he was transferred there after he arrived. Why was he transferred to a high-security unit a week before his death? Regime violation. Her voice didn't waver. Malloy watched her carefully. Something about her superior's demeanor seemed unnatural to her, like a carefully rehearsed play. By evening, they had their first suspect, Roy Harris. His interrogation lasted 3 hours. Where were you at the time of the murder? In my cell. I can provide a dozen witnesses. Do you have an alibi for every minute of it? There's always an alibi in prison, detective, especially if you have to. Graves and Malloy sat up late into the night going over testimony on things not right here. Malloy spread out the crime scene photos. Look, the book in the victim's hand, the reasoning of reason, why that one, random. Maybe there are accidents in prison. She rubbed her tired eyes, especially in murders like this. They didn't realize they were being watched. Susana stood at the window of her office, watching the detectives walk to the car. Her reflection in the glass seemed ghostly on the desk. As an envelope with the results of her latest HIV test. She didn't bother to open it. Oh, may things were better left unknown. Footsteps sounded outside the door as Dakota Ramsey brought in the evening report. Susana squared her shoulders and turned toward the door. The game was just beginning. On the third day of the investigation, Malloy had discovered her first lead. Reviewing the security footage, she noticed a strange pattern. On the day of the murder, 4 cameras in the hallway leading to the library went out of service for 3 minutes at a time. It's not a coincidence, she told Graves. Someone in the administration helped organize the assassination. They started digging deeper. The guard duty schedule showed unusual changes in the week before the murder eve. While experienced wardens had been transferred to other units, they were replaced by rookies who didn't know the internal rules well. The interrogation of the prisoners had become a game of silence. It was as if each of them was reading from a visible script. Nothing, didn't hear anything, was in the cell at the time. Only one inmate, a young guy with a tattoo on his neck, casually mentioned. Harris said it was a gift for the warden. An hour later, he was found in the shower room with his head bashed in, survived by a miracle. Graves and Malloy questioned Dr. Frost again. This time, she was more nervous than usual. What do you know about Mr. Ketty and Mrs. Simpson's relationship? Yeah, I can't discuss patients' medical records. This is about murder, Malloy reminded her gently. Frost snapped, told her about the test results, about Ketty's diagnosis, about Susana's test, about how the supervisor had changed after receiving the results. A picture was beginning to emerge: motive, revenge, a carefully planned murder at the hands of others. But there was no proof. Harris and his men were silent. The guards averted their eyes. Dakota Ramsey stood a wall between the detectives and her boss. He thought of everything Graves said, looking at the evidence board. Use the system against the system. Malloy walked to the window in the prison yard. Susana Simpson was talking to a group of guards, straight back, confident gestures, a commanding turn of her shoulders. You know what the worst part is? Asked Age quietly. She really loved him. Otherwise, she would have just shot him herself. They checked phone records, reviewed emails, interviewed the staff. Nothing, not a single piece of direct evidence, just circumstantial evidence and conjecture. Roy Harris smiled in a last interrogation. Oh, meet 'em. Bad things happen to bad people, detective, especially in prison. On the evening of the 9th day of the investigation, Graves and Malloy sat in an empty office looking at file folders. We know she did it, Malloy said. Knowing doesn't mean proving it. Graves replied. A crime scene photo lay on the table, the book, Reasoning, clutched in a dead hand, a final message from the killer or from the victim. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, the clear, steady tapping of heels. Susana Simpson walked through her prison like a queen through a palace. He had won, and she knew it. And somewhere in the depths of the prison corridors, the inmates were whispering, passing from cell to cell, a new legend, that of the warden who knew how to wait and knew how to have. The Rodger Ketty murder case file landed on the district attorney's desk exactly 1 month after the tragedy. Detectives Graves and Malloy presented all the evidence they had collected: camera footage, witness statements, forensics. Not enough, the DA said, slamming the folder shut. It's all circumstantial, it'll fall apart in court. On the first day, they knew he was right. Susana Simpson had built the perfect scheme. No direct contact, no explicit orders, just random coincidences and odd circumstances. Roy Harris got extra time for order but kept quiet during all the interrogations. His accomplice remained silent too. In the pre-on world, there are scarier things than extra time. Susana went back to work as if nothing had happened. He was still holding meetings, checking documents, keeping order. Only now, there was something new in her eyes, cold, dangerous. The library had been renovated. The new librarian, an elderly man with a quiet voice, put the books in their places. Only the volume of Reasoning had disappeared. It had been entered into evidence. Dakota Ramsey was the only living witness to that story. Yes, all Susana change, as if every day something in her died, giving way to something else, harder, darker. On the last day of the investigation, Malloy came into the warden's office. You know what we know, don't you? She said. It's not what we know that matters in our work, Susana replied, it's what we can prove. They stared at each other for a long minute, two women on opposite sides of the law, but so similar in their understanding of justice. A year past Riverbend Penitentiary lived its ordinary life. Susana Simpson still ran the prison, tough, efficient, flawless. Her gray hair had turned completely white, but her posture remained as straight. In the evenings, she sometimes came into the library, standing between the shelves, touching the spines of books, perhaps reminiscing, maybe just thinking about the thin line between love and hate. And somewhere in the archives of THE Department of Corrections was a file with an unsolved case. On the last page, Detective Malloy had written, "Sometimes justice doesn't come through the law, sometimes it comes through pain, betrayal, and revenge, and no one knows what the higher price will be, to love and be betrayed, or to take revenge and lose oneself." The case was closed, but the story remains as a reminder that within the walls of prison, even love can become a deadly weapon. If you found yourself captivated by this complex tale of love and betrayal within the walls of Riverbend Penitentiary, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think will happen to Susana and RBB Rodger? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more gripping narratives that challenge the norms of love and loyalty. Your engagement fuels our passion for storytelling, and we can't wait to hear you.